In the late 1930s, the United States stood at a crossroads between isolation and engagement. The echoes of the First World War were still deeply etched in the national psyche, shaping both political policy and public sentiment. Millions of Americans remembered the staggering loss of life, the economic disruption, and the ambiguous outcome of a war that had seemed far away, yet had claimed so many. The Great Depression had left the nation focused inward, rebuilding its economy and striving to stabilize families and communities. As Europe descended into chaos in 1939, most Americans viewed the conflict across the Atlantic with a mixture of concern and detachment. Headlines screamed of Germany's aggressive expansion, the invasion of Poland, and the swift conquest of France. But the prevailing attitude in Congress and among the general public leaned toward neutrality. The Neutrality Acts passed during the 1930s reflected this sentiment. Strict legislation designed to prevent the United States from being drawn into another foreign war, forbidding loans and arms sales to belligerent nations. Yet beneath the surface, the American government watched the unfolding crisis with growing apprehension. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, though constrained by law and wary of isolationist opposition, understood the strategic importance of Europe's survival. Britain and France were not merely foreign nations in distress. They were key players in the balance of power that, if disrupted, could pose a threat to global stability and ultimately to American security. Among the public, awareness of the war grew gradually through newspapers, newsreels, and radio broadcasts. Americans saw images of bombed cities, refugee columns, and advancing German troops. They read about the fall of Paris and the miraculous evacuation at Dunkirk. These stories painted a picture of Europe in freefall, yet many Americans struggled to feel an immediate sense of urgency. For most, the Atlantic Ocean seemed a natural barrier, a protective divide that rendered the continent's struggles distant and abstract. Nevertheless, the human dimension of the war resonated. Reports of civilian suffering, displaced children, and heroic acts of resistance elicited empathy. Stories of pilots scrambling to defend London from relentless Luftwaffe attacks captivated audiences. For the first time, Americans began to grasp that the fate of freedom in Europe might have consequences far beyond its borders. Newspapers began to cover the stories of the Royal Air Force, focusing on the young pilots who risked their lives daily to protect their nation. Some publications highlighted the valor of non-British volunteers, noting that men from across the globe were answering Britain's call for aid. These stories stirred imaginations and sparked debates in households and cafes across the United States. How could a democracy remain on the sidelines while the forces of tyranny advanced unchecked? As news of the Battle of Britain intensified, a quiet but growing movement emerged within America. Young men, inspired by tales of heroism, began to consider the possibility of leaving home to join the fight abroad. Though it was illegal for U.S. citizens to enlist in foreign armies at the time, determined volunteers sought ways around these restrictions. Some traveled first to Canada, where the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan offered legal avenues to train and eventually transfer to the RAF. Others journeyed directly to Britain, often risking diplomatic repercussions, motivated by a sense of duty and the belief that freedom could not survive if Britain fell. The first volunteers faced cultural shock, rigorous training, and the reality that their homeland would not provide immediate support. They left behind families, friends, and futures uncertain in every way. Yet they carried with them the conviction that action, even across an ocean, was morally necessary. Beyond individual volunteers, the American industrial landscape also began to pivot toward the looming global conflict. Factories that had produced cars, tractors, and consumer goods were increasingly scrutinized for their potential to support military production. Engineers and executives debated how to transition to wartime manufacturing should the nation be drawn into the conflict. While official policy remained neutral, the seeds of industrial mobilization were planted, ensuring that when the time came, America could supply not only its own forces, but also its allies. Public sentiment, however, remained deeply divided. Isolationists, prominent in political discourse, argued that America had no business intervening in European wars. Interventionists, on the other hand, cited moral obligation and strategic necessity, warning that Hitler's ambitions would eventually threaten the United States if left unchecked. Radio debates, newspaper editorials, and political speeches reflected this tension, shaping the context in which future volunteers would make their decisions. In parallel, popular culture began to subtly reflect the brewing conflict. Films, novels, and newsreels presented stories of courage, adventure, and resistance against tyranny. While still technically neutral, Hollywood produced material that highlighted the heroism of European defenders, reinforcing the perception that the struggle across the Atlantic was not abstract, but immediate and real. For young Americans contemplating action, these stories provided inspiration and a model of valor to emulate. By mid-1940, the situation in Europe had become dire. France had fallen, Belgium and the Netherlands were occupied, and the British Isles faced the brunt of German aggression alone. London was under constant threat, with air raids inflicting casualties and devastating infrastructure. The Luftwaffe dominated much of the continent's airspace, and British pilots faced overwhelming odds. Americans observing from afar understood that if Britain fell, Nazi Germany would dominate Western Europe, reshaping global politics and endangering the values of democracy and liberty worldwide. Against this backdrop, a new generation of Americans made a decision that would alter history. They chose to defy legal restrictions, cross oceans, and engage in a war that was not officially theirs. Motivated by idealism, adventure, and moral conviction, these young men laid the foundation for what would later become the Eagle Squadrons in the RAF. Their courage would provide not only tactical support, but also a symbolic bridge between nations, foreshadowing America's eventual entry into the war and the unprecedented alliance that would shape the 20th century. In the end, America before the war was a nation standing at the edge of history, torn between isolation and engagement, fear and action, policy and conscience. It was in this uncertain landscape that the first seeds of transatlantic heroism were sown. Young men preparing to leave home, factories beginning to imagine wartime production, and a society slowly awakening to the realities beyond its borders. These were the Americans who would soon join the skies over Britain, whose decisions in 1940 would resonate across history, and whose bravery would become a testament to the enduring spirit of freedom and sacrifice. The call of duty was louder than the law for a small but determined group of young Americans in 1940. While the United States remained officially neutral, these men felt compelled to take action, inspired by reports of Britain's desperate fight against the Luftwaffe. For many, the choice was personal, a moral imperative that outweighed the risks of traveling thousands of miles to engage in a war their country had not yet joined. The first step for most volunteers was Canada, where the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan provided a legal and structured pathway to RAF service. The journey north was itself a test of resolve. Trains carried hopeful recruits through snow-covered landscapes and across long, isolated stretches of prairie. They left behind the familiar sights and comforts of American towns, knowing that what awaited them was uncertainty, hardship, and danger. Arrival in Canada brought its own challenges. Airfields were often located in remote areas, and facilities were sparse. Trainees were immersed immediately in the discipline and rigor of military life. Early mornings began with drills, physical training, and classroom lessons on aerodynamics, navigation, and aircraft mechanics. The young Americans, many of whom had never flown beyond small civilian planes, were introduced to the technical complexity of the Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft they would eventually operate. The training regimen was unforgiving. Instructors expected precision and focus, and errors could be fatal. Pilots learned to take off and land on short, uneven runways, to read weather conditions and to anticipate mechanical failures. Simulated dogfights honed reflexes and taught the principles of formation flying, energy management, and aerial tactics. Despite the grueling pace, the volunteers displayed remarkable adaptability. Their eagerness to learn, coupled with a natural aptitude for flying, allowed many to progress faster than expected. Bonds formed quickly among trainees. Men from New York, Chicago, Boston, and small rural towns forged friendships in the face of shared challenge, united by courage and a singular purpose. Letters home reflected a mixture of excitement and anxiety, often tempered by the awareness that each flight brought them closer to a reality in which mistakes could be deadly. Some Americans, unwilling to wait for official channels, found alternative routes directly to Britain. These individuals often faced legal gray areas, navigating complex immigration rules and risking arrest. Yet for them, the urgency of Britain's plight outweighed the consequences. Upon arrival in England, the volunteers were confronted with a foreign land under siege. Air raid sirens blared through towns, blackouts obscured streets, and the threat of Luftwaffe bombing raids was a constant presence. Living quarters were Spartan, with makeshift barracks and communal mess halls. But the sense of purpose united these young men more than comfort ever could. Initial impressions of the RAF ranged from awe to intimidation. Experienced British pilots, some hardened veterans of early sorties, evaluated the Americans with skepticism. Many volunteers were perceived as inexperienced or naive, yet over time their skill, audacity, and determination earned respect. They were integrated into mixed squadrons, flying alongside British and Commonwealth pilots in a partnership that transcended nationality. In the air, they had to adapt quickly. Communication protocols, formation tactics, and combat doctrines were all unfamiliar, and mistakes could be fatal. Yet the Americans' willingness to take calculated risks, combined with a determination to protect their squadron mates, allowed them to thrive under the pressure of combat operations. Among the earliest and most notable volunteers was Billy Fisk, a young Olympian from Connecticut. Fisk exemplified the qualities that would define the American contribution: daring, skill, and an unshakable commitment to the mission. His story inspired others to follow, proving that courage and talent could overcome obstacles of nationality, experience, or bureaucracy. Training and integration were not limited to flying skills. The volunteers also had to learn the culture and etiquette of British military life. Mealtimes, drills, and social interactions followed rules that were unfamiliar to Americans. Tea replaced coffee, accents required careful listening, and humor became a bridge across cultural divides. These lessons in adaptability would prove essential in the high-stakes environment of aerial combat, where trust and cohesion were as critical as skill with the controls. The transition from trainee to combat-ready pilot was a journey marked by intense emotional strain. Every mission carried the possibility of death, and every error could have catastrophic consequences. The Americans confronted these realities with a mix of fear and resolve, gradually developing the mental fortitude that would serve them in the crucible of the Battle of Britain. By mid-1940, the first volunteers were ready for operational deployment. They were assigned to squadrons defending the southeastern coast of England, a frontline region where the Luftwaffe's attacks were frequent and ferocious. Their initial sorties were terrifying, exposing them to the raw chaos of aerial combat. Enemy fighters and bombers swarmed through the sky, a tracer fire and smoke marking the destruction of aircraft in every direction. For many Americans, the first encounter with combat was a baptism by fire, a moment that demanded instinct, courage, and rapid learning. Some were forced to bail out over fields or the English Channel, experiencing the terrifying solitude of parachuting into hostile territory. Others returned exhilarated, adrenaline still coursing, having survived encounters that would define their skill and reputation. Despite the dangers, these early experiences solidified the Americans' place within the RAF. Their bravery and performance in combat earned respect from British officers and fellow pilots, who came to rely on their skill and audacity. The presence of American volunteers also carried symbolic weight. Though the United States remained neutral, these men acted decisively to defend freedom in a distant land, demonstrating that the fight against tyranny was not bound by borders. By late 1940, American volunteers were not just auxiliaries. They were integrated, respected, and increasingly essential members of the RAF's effort to defend Britain. Their contributions extended beyond their actions in the sky. The story of these young men inspired both the British public and those back home in America, providing tangible evidence of the shared values and emerging cooperation that would define the Allied effort. They became a bridge between nations, exemplifying courage, skill, and moral conviction. The journey from their hometowns in the United States to the battle-scarred airfields of England was not merely a geographical one. It was a transformation of character, a forging of identity, as warriors committed to a cause larger than themselves. They were pioneers, facing uncertainty, adversity, and death with unwavering determination. Their stories would become legends, setting the stage for the historic aerial battles to come and the enduring legacy of American volunteers in the skies over Britain. The moment an American volunteer first climbed into the cockpit of a Spitfire or Hurricane, reality shifted. The narrow fuselage pressed against shoulders, the smell of oil and fuel filled the air, and the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared beneath them like a living creature. Beyond the canopy, the English sky stretched vast and unpredictable, a theater where life and death danced in seconds. Training had prepared the pilots for maneuvers, formation, flying, and emergency procedures, but nothing could replicate the chaos of real combat. The first operational sorties were a baptism by fire. Over the coast of southern England, radar stations had picked up incoming German formations, Dornier Du-17s, Heinkel He-111s, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. Every pilot had seconds to assess threats, calculate angles of attack, and decide whether to dive, climb, or engage. Mistakes were often fatal. Many American volunteers experienced raw terror for the first time. Their hearts raced, stomachs churned, and adrenaline sharpened senses beyond normal limits. Some gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity, eyes flicking between instruments and the sky. Others discovered a strange calm, a tunnel of focus where instinct guided decisions. Dogfights were a deadly ballet. Pilots spiraled, weaved, climbed, and dived, seeking the advantage of altitude, speed, and positioning. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky, painting fire in the clouds. Smoke trailed downed aircraft, a grim reminder of the lethal stakes. American pilots, initially perceived as audacious and sometimes reckless, quickly demonstrated skill and daring that earned them respect from British comrades. Their willingness to press attacks aggressively disrupted enemy formations, often saving British pilots and civilians below. Wingmen became inseparable partners, relying on split-second communication and trust, their survival dependent on coordination as much as on individual skill. Each engagement brought lessons, hard-learned. Some pilots lost aircraft, parachuting into fields or over the English Channel. Others returned exhilarated, having scored their first victories, their adrenaline mingling with a profound understanding of mortality and responsibility. The Americans adapted rapidly to RAF doctrine, using the sun for concealment, coordinating tight formations, climbing to energy advantage, and exploiting weaknesses in enemy tactics. They blended courage with learned discipline, gradually becoming not just competent flyers, but effective warriors in the air. The experience also forged deep bonds of camaraderie. In airfields, mess halls, and hangars, pilots shared stories, fears, and laughter. Letters home documented their experiences with careful balance, describing heroism while sparing families the worst horrors. Shared danger created friendships that transcended nationality, establishing bonds that would endure long after the war. Beyond personal valor, these sorties had strategic significance. The Americans' actions disrupted bombing runs, forced enemy fighters into disadvantageous positions, and contributed to Britain's ability to defend key cities and airfields. Every aircraft downed or intercepted reduced pressure on London and southern England, buying time for the RAF to regroup, repair, and launch subsequent sorties. As weeks passed, the Americans became indispensable. Their audacity, combined with the relentless skill of British pilots, turned the tide in localized engagements. Pilots like Billy Fisk became emblematic figures, demonstrating that a single individual's courage could ripple across squadrons and missions, inspiring others and shaping morale. Fatigue and fear remained constant companions. Sorties lasted hours, sleep was fitful, and every landing carried the risk of mechanical failure or enemy attack. Injuries were frequent, yet pilots pressed on, driven by duty, camaraderie, and the knowledge that the survival of Britain depended on their actions. Through these experiences, the American volunteers transformed from idealistic young men into battle-hardened aviators. Each mission honed reflexes, sharpened instincts, and reinforced the principles of teamwork and trust. By late summer 1940, they had established themselves not only as capable fighters, but as integral components of Fighter Command's defense strategy. Their impact extended beyond tactical victories. The presence of American pilots had psychological effects on both allies and enemies. British civilians saw courage from across the Atlantic, reinforcing hope and resilience. Enemy pilots faced unfamiliar and fearless adversaries who refused to retreat, challenging their assumptions and forcing them to adapt. In the broader context, these early missions presaged the increasing role of American support, both in manpower and material, in the ongoing war. The bravery, skill, and determination of a few volunteers highlighted the potential for collaboration between nations and foreshadowed the strategic alliance that would define the next phase of the conflict. Ultimately, the first combat experiences of American volunteers demonstrated the fusion of courage, training, and adaptability. They showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, disciplined skill and bold action could influence the outcome of battles, protect lives on the ground, and contribute materially to a nation's survival. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, once machines of metal and engineering, became extensions of the pilots themselves, instruments through which human ingenuity, bravery, and resolve could be expressed. In the crucible of air combat, young Americans learned the most profound lessons of the war: the cost of freedom, the necessity of cooperation, and the extraordinary capacity of individuals to shape history through courage, skill, and sacrifice. By the end of these initial sorties, the American volunteers had not only survived, they had begun to leave their mark on the skies over Britain, proving that heroism knows no borders, and that the Atlantic Ocean could not separate courage from duty. While the brave young Americans soared over the skies of Britain, another front of the war was unfolding thousands of miles away. The factories, assembly lines, and workshops of the United States. Though the nation was officially neutral in 1940, its industrial capacity quietly began to shift in response to the mounting crisis in Europe. The fall of France and the relentless Luftwaffe assaults on British cities made it clear that the survival of Britain depended not only on the courage of its pilots, but also on the continuous supply of aircraft, engines, and munitions. American manufacturers, from Detroit to Connecticut, were uniquely positioned to provide this support. Automobile plants, once devoted to producing cars, were converted to produce engines, propellers, and other specialized aircraft components. Skilled workers adapted to new technologies, learning to build Merlin engines that powered Spitfires, as well as other critical machinery. Each engine represented more than metal and precision parts. It was a lifeline, enabling pilots to take to the skies day after day. The Lend-Lease program, though formally enacted in 1941, had its origins in the months preceding its passage. The U.S. government, in conjunction with private industry, began to facilitate shipments of aircraft, equipment, and supplies to Britain, carefully navigating neutrality laws. Merchant ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying crates of engines, ammunition, and aviation fuel, often under threat from German U-boats lurking beneath the waves. Every successful delivery was a victory in itself, ensuring that the RAF could continue operations even as losses mounted in the skies. Beyond engines and aircraft, the Americans contributed critical technological expertise. Engineers collaborated with British mechanics, providing guidance on maintaining high-performance aircraft, optimizing fuel efficiency, and improving combat readiness. These exchanges were mutually beneficial. American innovations were adapted to British planes, and lessons learned from RAF experience informed U.S. industrial processes, creating a feedback loop that strengthened both sides. Factories operated around the clock, driven by a sense of urgency that transcended borders. Every shift produced engines, airframes, and weaponry that would reach England in time to sustain squadrons under constant attack. The scale of production was staggering. Tens of thousands of parts, hundreds of engines, and dozens of aircraft shipped each month, all coordinated across oceans and political constraints. The human element of this industrial effort was significant as well. Workers understood that their labor was more than employment. It was part of a larger mission. Letters and reports from assembly lines described pride in contributing to the defense of a distant ally, a recognition that their craftsmanship directly affected the lives of pilots they would never meet, but whose courage they supported. The psychological impact on British pilots and civilians was profound. Knowing that American industry was backing them, supplying the tools of survival, provided reassurance amid relentless bombardment. Spitfires could return to service quickly after damage, munitions were replenished, and replacement aircraft arrived steadily. This support allowed RAF squadrons to sustain the pressure against the Luftwaffe, maintaining morale and operational capacity. Lend-Lease also extended beyond aircraft. Raw materials, fuel, and even food were shipped to Britain, ensuring not only military readiness but civilian resilience. Factories that produced steel, aluminum, and other essential materials contributed indirectly to the front line, underscoring that modern warfare required the integration of multiple sectors. As the autumn of 1940 approached, the scale and efficiency of American support became increasingly evident. Entire RAF operations depended on this transatlantic lifeline. The work of engineers, factory workers, and logistics specialists across the United States directly influenced the outcome of engagements over southern England. Their labor ensured that pilots had the machines, ammunition, and fuel necessary to continue defending their nation. Symbolically, the industrial might of America represented more than material support. It was a statement of solidarity and shared purpose. Even as political debates raged about neutrality, the flow of equipment, knowledge, and expertise demonstrated that the defense of freedom transcended legal boundaries. American factories, quietly humming with activity, were as critical to the Battle of Britain as any fighter squadron in the air. The collaboration between nations and industries highlighted the strategic importance of preparation, logistics, and foresight in modern warfare. Pilots in the air could rely on their machines, knowing that meticulous work thousands of miles away ensured their survival. Each successful sortie was enabled by the precision and dedication of workers who had never seen combat, yet whose efforts directly determined its outcome. By the end of 1940, the cumulative effect of American industrial support was undeniable. The RAF had survived sustained Luftwaffe attacks, partially due to the steady stream of aircraft and equipment from across the Atlantic. American volunteers, flying alongside British and Commonwealth pilots, were emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone. Their machines and munitions were backed by the unparalleled capacity of American industry. The lessons of this period resonated far beyond immediate military necessity. They demonstrated the value of international collaboration, the potential of industrial mobilization, and the interplay between technology and human courage in determining the outcome of war. The factories, docks, and warehouses of the United States became a battlefield of their own, a silent yet essential theater, where the fate of nations was influenced by innovation, skill, and determination. In essence, the industrial might of America was inseparable from the heroism of those in the air. Pilots' courage and skill could not have achieved their full effect without the relentless support of engineers, workers, and logisticians across the ocean. Together, human bravery and industrial capability created a synergy that sustained Britain's defense, ensured the survival of democracy in Western Europe, and laid the foundation for the global coalition that would ultimately defeat the Axis powers. The story of Lend-Lease, factories, and transatlantic logistics is as compelling as the dogfights themselves. It reminds us that victory in war is rarely the result of individual heroism alone. It is also the product of preparation, coordination, and the tireless dedication of those who provide the tools and support necessary for that heroism to succeed. The legacy of this period endures in the annals of history, a testament to how industrial might, when coupled with vision and moral purpose, can tip the scales in a struggle for survival. Every Spitfire that roared over Britain, every round fired in defense of London, carried the imprint of American hands craftsmen, engineers, and visionaries whose contributions were critical to the survival of a nation and the preservation of freedom. The summer of 1940 had brought Britain to the brink, and the skies above southern England had become the ultimate battlefield. American volunteers who had crossed oceans and navigated legal and logistical hurdles to join the Royal Air Force now faced the true test of their courage. Dogfights, bombing raids, and relentless Luftwaffe assaults defined their daily reality, and every sortie carried the possibility of life or death. The pilots' first missions were harrowing. They encountered formations of Heinkel He-111s, Dornier Do 17s, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers, protected by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Every engagement demanded split-second decisions: when to climb, dive, or turn, how to position for a shot, and how to protect wingmen and civilians below. The Americans, initially considered outsiders, quickly proved their skill and audacity. They pressed attacks aggressively, often breaking enemy formations and drawing fighters away from bombers, a tactic that saved countless lives on the ground. Among the earliest volunteers, men like Billy Fisk and Vernon Keogh distinguished themselves through daring maneuvers, precision shooting, and fearless leadership in combat. Their actions inspired both British and fellow American pilots, creating a ripple effect that strengthened squadron cohesion and morale. September 1940 marked the crescendo of these engagements. On the 15th, the Luftwaffe launched a massive assault aimed at crippling Britain's air defenses. Radar stations had already picked up hundreds of incoming aircraft, and fighter command scrambled every available squadron. The Americans, integrated into RAF units, took to the skies, fully aware that the outcome of the day could determine the fate of the nation. The aerial battle was chaotic and intense. Tracer fire streaked across the sky, engines screamed, and planes twisted and turned in desperate maneuvers. Smoke trailed from downed aircraft, and parachutes blossomed like flowers over the English countryside. Amid the turmoil, American pilots executed daring attacks, intercepting bombers before they reached their targets and engaging enemy fighters with calculated aggression. These actions were decisive. By disrupting formations and drawing enemy aircraft into disadvantageous positions, the Americans played a key role in preventing catastrophic damage to London and southern airfields. Their contribution was not measured solely by the number of planes destroyed, but by the lives saved and the resilience sustained within the RAF. Beyond the statistics, individual stories of heroism defined the human dimension of the battle. Pilots faced fear, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Some were forced to bail out over enemy territory or the cold waters of the English Channel, relying on skill, luck, and the courage of comrades for survival. Others returned triumphant, having scored their first victories, their exhilaration tempered by the knowledge of loss among fellow pilots. The American volunteers also brought a unique spirit to the RAF squadrons. Their boldness, sometimes bordering on recklessness, complemented the disciplined strategies of British pilots. This synergy of daring and methodical planning proved highly effective, especially during the most desperate engagements. The presence of Americans in the skies also had a profound psychological impact. British civilians, enduring nightly air raids and witnessing their defenders' courage, drew hope from the fact that young men from across the Atlantic had joined the fight. Enemy pilots, in turn, faced a formidable new adversary, fearless, adaptable, and unpredictable. Many of these Americans became symbolic figures. Newspapers and radio reports highlighted their heroics, and their names became known not just in Britain, but also back in the United States. Even as neutrality remained official policy, their deeds inspired Americans at home and foreshadowed the broader alliance that would form in the coming years. Over the weeks of sustained combat, patterns of skill, bravery, and sacrifice emerged. Some pilots became adept at specific maneuvers, diving from high altitude to intercept bombers, turning tightly to evade enemy fighters, or coordinating complex attacks in mixed squadrons. Others distinguished themselves by leadership, mentoring new recruits, and maintaining morale under extreme stress. Collectively, their efforts demonstrated that victory in the air depended not only on individual talent, but also on trust, coordination, and the ability to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. The losses were real and painful. Many American pilots paid the ultimate price, their planes destroyed in combat, and their lives cut short. RAF squadrons mourned these fallen comrades, honoring their memory while continuing the fight. Memorials and records would later preserve their legacy, ensuring that their courage was never forgotten. These stories, interwoven with technical skill and strategic impact, created a narrative that transcended individual battles. The Americans were not merely auxiliary forces, they were integral to the defense of Britain, demonstrating that heroism could cross oceans, cultures, and legal boundaries. Their presence strengthened the RAF, boosted morale, and sent a clear message to both allies and enemies that the fight for freedom was international in nature. By late 1940, the American volunteers had earned the respect and trust of British leadership. They were relied upon for critical missions, recognized for their tactical acumen, and celebrated for their courage. Their actions contributed significantly to the RAF's ability to withstand the Luftwaffe's sustained offensives, and their influence extended beyond the skies. The stories of heroism from this period also influenced future policy and collaboration. Lessons learned from American integration into RAF squadrons informed the planning of future Allied operations, including the deployment of U.S. forces after the official entry into the war. The courage, adaptability, and commitment demonstrated by these volunteers provided a blueprint for international cooperation in combat operations. Ultimately, the legacy of the heroes in the skies is both tactical and symbolic. They exemplified the principles of bravery, solidarity, and moral action in the face of overwhelming danger. Their actions preserved Britain's air defenses during a critical juncture, inspired civilians and soldiers alike, and demonstrated that a few determined individuals could influence the course of history. The courage displayed in those dogfights over southern England became a touchstone for future generations, a reminder that valor, skill, and commitment can transcend borders and reshape outcomes. The American volunteers' story in the Battle of Britain encapsulates the essence of heroism in modern warfare, the combination of technical mastery, personal courage, and the willingness to act decisively under unimaginable pressure. Every mission flown, every enemy aircraft intercepted, and every life saved contributed to the larger narrative of resistance against tyranny. By the end of 1940, the Americans were no longer outsiders. They were eagles in the RAF, respected, feared by the enemy, and remembered for generations to come. As the skies over Britain gradually cleared and the relentless Luftwaffe raids subsided, the impact of the American volunteers in the Royal Air Force became profoundly clear. These young men, who had crossed an ocean to join a foreign fight, had left an indelible mark on both the Battle of Britain and the broader trajectory of World War II. Their contributions were tactical, moral, and symbolic, intertwining heroism with transatlantic solidarity in a way that resonated far beyond the immediate battles they fought. On a practical level, the American pilots' actions directly influenced the outcome of numerous engagements. Though their numbers were relatively small compared to the overall RAF force, their presence was disproportionately significant. Their audacity in aerial combat, willingness to take calculated risks, and adaptability to British flying tactics disrupted Luftwaffe operations and saved countless lives on the ground. Individual heroism often had strategic implications. A single daring interception of a bomber formation could prevent destruction in London, safeguard airfields, or protect vital supply routes. Beyond these concrete contributions, the Americans' presence inspired their British counterparts. Stories of courage, determination, and sacrifice crossed squadron lines, boosting morale during the most grueling days of the Battle of Britain. The knowledge that men from another nation had committed themselves to the defense of freedom, risking life and limb far from home, strengthened cohesion and fostered an enduring sense of camaraderie. Integration into RAF squadrons was a remarkable achievement in itself. The volunteers had to adapt to unfamiliar protocols, communication methods, and operational doctrines, all while performing under extreme pressure. Their ability to merge instinctive bravery with structured RAF tactics created pilots capable of extraordinary feats, highlighting the power of flexibility, courage, and teamwork. Symbolically, the American volunteers embodied a bridge between two nations, proving that freedom and the fight against tyranny were not confined by geography. Their efforts foreshadowed the full-scale American engagement that would follow in 1941, signaling to the world that the United States was capable of decisive action in the defense of democratic ideals. The human dimension of their legacy is equally compelling. Many of these young men made the ultimate sacrifice, leaving behind grieving families thousands of miles away. Their deaths, though tragic, were honored in Britain and America alike through memorials, plaques, ceremonies, and the careful preservation of personal letters and records. These acts of remembrance ensured that their bravery would not fade into obscurity, but would be etched into collective memory as a testament to the courage of individuals who acted in the service of a greater cause. The legacy of the American volunteers also influenced the evolution of military collaboration between the United States and Britain. Their early integration into RAF operations provided practical lessons for joint planning, cross-cultural coordination, and the efficient deployment of personnel and resources. When the United States officially entered the war, these lessons proved invaluable, allowing American forces to operate effectively alongside British units in Europe, North Africa, and beyond. Museums, air shows, and restored aircraft continue to commemorate their achievements. Spitfires and Hurricanes, often bearing the markings of American pilots, fly across skies as living reminders of the courage and skill demonstrated during the Battle of Britain. Exhibits highlight individual stories, technical innovations, and the human experiences of the volunteers, preserving their legacy for future generations. On a personal level, the experiences of the American volunteers reveal a profound humanity beneath the heroism. Diaries, letters, and photographs convey moments of fear, camaraderie, exhilaration, and grief. They reflect the psychological and emotional landscape of young men confronting mortality in unfamiliar skies, navigating the bonds of friendship, and discovering the meaning of sacrifice. These narratives humanize history, showing that wars are fought not only with machines and strategies, but with the spirit, determination, and courage of individuals who choose to act decisively in moments of crisis. Today, the story of the American volunteers in the Battle of Britain stands as a testament to bravery, selflessness, and the power of international cooperation. It reminds us that even when nations hesitate, individuals can act in defense of principles that transcend borders. Their legacy is one of skill, moral conviction, and extraordinary determination, demonstrating how small numbers of dedicated people can shape the outcome of history. In retrospect, the contributions of these volunteers can be seen both practically and symbolically. Practically, they bolstered RAF strength, provided crucial support in critical battles, and preserved Britain's ability to resist the Luftwaffe. Symbolically, they represented the ideals of courage, solidarity, and the shared commitment to freedom, inspiring contemporaries and future generations alike. As we reflect on the Battle of Britain, it is impossible to separate the heroism of the RAF's few from the daring of American volunteers who flew alongside them. Together, they forged a legacy that continues to resonate in aviation history, military strategy, and the broader story of World War II. Their tale is not merely one of aircraft, squadrons, or tactics. It is a narrative of the human spirit, its resilience, and its capacity to rise to extraordinary challenges. The Eagles of the Atlantic, as they came to be remembered, ensured that Britain endured, that hope persisted, and that a small cadre of determined men could leave an enduring mark on history. Their courage, skill, and sacrifice remain etched in the annals of the Second World War, a lasting tribute to the power of bravery, moral conviction, and transatlantic solidarity in the defense of freedom. In the end, the legacy of these young Americans is inseparable from the larger story of the Battle of Britain. They transformed from volunteers into legends, from outsiders into heroes, leaving behind a narrative that continues to inspire pilots, historians, and citizens worldwide. Their actions remind us that valor, when combined with skill and conviction, can cross oceans and generations, and that a small group of determined individuals can change the course of history, ensuring that freedom survives even in the darkest hours.